Okay, well, hello everybody. My name is Tom. I'm an educator here at Cheehaw Park and Zoo. And today I'm going to be hosting this teacher workshop, and I hope it's super helpful for everybody who's here and those who may get to see it in the future. So today, my talk, just to provide a little bit of context, is going to be focused a little bit more on research that I've done in the past, and I hope that this is useful in that if any of you teachers are going to be talking to your students in the future about conservation biology or ecology, this can provide some knowledge on research that has actually taken place. So I'm going to provide some firsthand knowledge on some of the research I did up in the subarctic as well as elsewhere. And so I worked with a lot of people in Maine as well. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is research that took place in Maine and some results that actually came out of that work. And please feel free to reach out afterwards or anything like that if you'd like me to provide more information or maybe figures or anything like that that could go along with what I'm going to talk about. But I hope that this is a way to provide some context to some research that's actually taken place, and that can be kind of like, I guess, a little bit of supplemental information that can be used in the classroom. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because most of my talk is going to be based off of a PowerPoint. So let's see here. Okay, so my talk is titled Anthropogenic Effects on Wildlife. And so I figured, typically if I were going to be giving this talk to a class, which I've given variations of this talk before to students, and I think it's gone pretty well, I would just start off by, even introducing the idea of anthropogenic impacts, and just to hopefully get students to become aware of, really, that's just a fancy way for saying, how are we as humans impacting the physical and the natural environment? And so when we think about anthropogenic impacts, we think about things like we're overpopulating the planet, right? We're completely changing land cover to things that you can see here, like cities, overpopulating, so you can see with the traffic there. I also included the traffic because that's a big source of emissions, which is contributing to climate change and warming. So that's a huge anthropogenic impact. I'm kind of putting emphasis on that one because that's going to be really relevant to parts of my talk today, and was very relevant to my research that I conducted. And then moving a little bit down a ways, pollution is a big one, right? And so I'll talk about pollution a tiny bit during this as well. Deforestation is a big one that happens in parts of the world. And then not necessarily just, land use change completely, but maybe things like habitat degradation and fragmentation. And so I included a picture of a dam on a waterway down in the bottom right hand corner, and we'll talk about that a little bit during this as well. So a lot of this talk is going to focus on how we as humans are impacting wildlife, and I know it seems a little doom and gloom, right? But that's what a lot of my research has been on in the past. And so both labs that I've worked in have been focused on amphibian conservation, but with kind of a human dimensions impact relationship, and in very different senses. So, but don't worry, I'm going to include as well some positive notes to end us off so that we can kind of understand, okay, so this research is important and we're doing it because there are some really severe anthropogenic impacts happening with amphibians. But what can we do with the research that we conducted to kind of put a positive spin on it and move forward in the future to help these animals? And so it's nice to get students thinking too about what animals are impacted by humans. And I guess the easy answer is pretty much all of them these days, right? I mean, if you think about warming in general, that's a global phenomenon. So all animals to some degree are being impacted by climate change. And so that's something to be conscious of. But I included this animal here, which is a wood frog, because I don't know what the odds were, but both I mentioned that I did research with amphibians and how they're impacted by humans. And both my primary projects happen to use this animal, this species, as our study organism. But they're nice anyway because they are a really good indicator species and they make for a really good study organism. But all animals are impacted by humans to some degree with some of those different topics that I talked about. But speaking of amphibians specifically, so what are some of the top threats to amphibians? So that includes habitat loss and degradation. So I talked about that a little bit, especially that frog that I talked about that I mentioned was my study organism. So a big one for them is wetland loss, and I will talk about that in just a slide or two. Habitat fragmentation. So even if the wetland itself is not lost, how much are we separating out wetlands from each other? So are populations able to remain in contact with each other genetically or otherwise? Invasive species introductions are a big one that can impact amphibians in different locations. So I've worked in a couple of locations where an amphibian species, so let's say a bullfrog, was found in some wetlands out west in Arizona, and they completely wipe out other amphibian populations. So if we see bullfrogs, they've done a really good job at eradicating them there. But if we find them there, we essentially take care of them immediately because they can be really invasive and they really do take over. So that's a big one. Diseases is becoming a big problem with amphibian research. So oftentimes when I was conducting my research, we had some pretty strict contamination protocols, or decontamination, I should say, even from wetland to wetland. So we could not even go to another wetland until we had fully sprayed down boots and made sure we took the necessary precautions to make sure that we weren't carrying any diseases from one wetland to another. And it's kind of scary to think about because, you know, we're purposely doing this research, and that oftentimes requires larger sample sizes, right? So we want to target multiple wetlands for replication, which is a big part of research, especially when you're doing ongoing projects. And that requires us to go from wetland to wetland, but it's like we don't want to be a source of transfer. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because we want to be going to as many wetlands as we can to get as much information as possible, but we also want to make sure we're really being careful about not spreading diseases because it is easy to spread them just from one wetland to the next. Drought's another big one. And again, we're going to focus on that quite a bit later in my talk because that's going to be linked to some implications of warming, especially up in one of my study sites, which I'll talk about. And then I guess I should have even put climate change before drought because drought is one of the potential outcomes of climate change or increased drought anyway. Okay, so one of the other big things I really like to do with students is ask them, why should we even care about amphibians? Amphibians are such a small animal, right? Most people probably don't even think about an amphibian as they go throughout their day. I know everybody's not like me and thinking about them on a daily basis. So it's fun to, you know, be like, what do you think is the importance of amphibian? Why should you care about an amphibian? And so just one way that I really like to justify it is by just protecting a certain amphibian species, you could potentially protect an entire habitat type, which is a kind of special kind of habitat type. And I'm going to talk about why it's often overlooked as well. But by protecting some of these animals that use these habitats, they can get protected, and then a whole number of other endangered and threatened species that also rely on these special habitats can be protected just by putting into law some protections for some of these amphibians. So what I'm referring to is a vernal pool. So a vernal pool is an isolated body of water found just in a forest floor depression. And because it's typically a relatively small wetland, potentially shallow, they're semi-permanent. They're gonna dry up most times seasonally. So they are only gonna hold water for 3 to 5 months, and then they're gonna dry up, which is important because if that water is drying up annually, that means that fish can't be present or any other potential predators that would rely on permanent water. And that's really important for amphibians that lay all these eggs and other animals such as we'll talk. I think I have a slide on an endangered dragonfly that uses temporary wetlands as well that also will lay eggs. And so they rely on those wetland characteristics of being a short-term wetland so that their tadpoles can hatch and grow and develop without any major predatory pressures from things like fish that would be otherwise found in a permanent body of water. So there's no permanent inlets or outlets. It's just a depression in the forest floor that fills from snowmelt and spring rain runoff, and these are also the same things that cue these amphibians to move to these vernal pools is warming temperatures, snowmelt, and rainfall. That's what triggers their response to move to these wetlands and start these intensive breeding patterns. So freshwater wetlands, especially temporary ones, are one of the most threatened freshwater habitat types because they're oftentimes overlooked or just not, people may not even realize they're there because if someone's going out and doing a habitat assessment in terms of where they can put up a building during the winter when it may be a little bit easier to do so, they're not going to be holding water, right? Or even if it's already dried out, it's not going to be holding water. So they may just say, just looks like forest patch to me, and they may just bulldoze right over it, right? And so it's really important to realize that just because there's not water in that location at any given point in a year doesn't mean that it doesn't seasonally turn into something much different and support a whole suite of diversity of different animals, including insects, amphibians, other animals will stop over at these wetlands. That's another way that we really like to get students excited about amphibians is these temporary wetlands can be important stopover points. It's kind of sad to think about, but animals are aware that amphibians are laying eggs in high numbers in these temporary wetlands, and it essentially just becomes a buffet for a lot of other animals as all these amphibians are emerging then. But anyway, it's just they're very easily overlooked, especially the smaller ones that are temporary. But even within a small wetland, you can have thousands of eggs. And so another one is fragmentation of these wetlands. So if people don't put the effort into properly screening for these wetlands and they just get knocked off one by one, left by right, then over time they're going to start disappearing, and the ones that do persist that may be a little bit more obvious are going to be severely fragmented or isolated from other ones that are persisting in other locations as well. So the further they start getting from each other, it's going to be more difficult for amphibians to disperse from one to the other. That's going to start resulting in some lack of genetic mixing between those different populations. And so, isolation can be a slippery slope towards population declines if these important habitat types are just overlooked. And then also warming is also a big one, just because they are only temporary wetlands, so they don't have too much water in them to begin with. So knocking down trees around these wetlands and exposing them to sun can cause them to dry up faster, or just even variability in climatic conditions can really alter how long these wetlands last. Okay, but on one of the more positive notes moving forward, so one thing that I've even kind of been trained on in the past, because I worked in these a lot when I was at the University of Maine, is trying to establish significance for vernal pools. Now, I never actually got any established myself, but I was aware of the process. And so just by using that wood frog that I showed you at the beginning, we can establish protection for these vernal pools and get them to be considered a significant vernal pool. And so if we can go out and survey a vernal pool and count up to 40 wood frog egg masses, or 20 spotted salamander egg masses, or 10 blue spotted salamander egg masses, or any combination of those, we can get this vernal pool brought to the attention of someone at the state level and have it established as a significant vernal pool and then protected, meaning that there's a certain amount of area around these vernal pools that can't be touched, and the vernal pool itself, the actual depression, cannot be touched. I have a slide on that as well. And this is a dragonfly I was telling you about. That's one of the endangered species. That's the ringed bog hunter dragonfly. And then another thing, and also, so amphibian abundance is the common way to get these vernal pools established as significant, but also if there's any other rare or threatened or endangered species that is observed at one of these locations, and we know that it's a type of habitat that's important for them to complete a critical part of their life history, then that can automatically get them established as significant as well. So there's an animal called a fairy shrimp. If fairy shrimp are found in any of these wetlands and brought to the attention of someone, they can automatically get established as significant as well. But what's cool is once you work in these for a while, you can start to pick up on signs that you can use to recognize these vernal pool depressions, even when there's absolutely no water in them. And so we like to train people on how to keep an eye out for these signs. So one of them is, if you're ever walking in the forest and you notice like a little freshwater clamshell or mussel shell or something like that, just sitting on a leaf or anything like that, that's a pretty good indication there was water there at some point and you might be in a vernal pool depression. Excuse me. And then also like little caddisfly casings are a good sign as well. And then a big one is looking for kind of like water ring marks on trees. So that can kind of be an indication of where the water had risen to at one point. And so that's a big one that you can look for as well, is looking for water lines on trees or logs or any other objects that may be, especially when you feel yourself going down slope a little bit. That can be a good one. And then you can kind of flag that site and bring it to someone's attention as well and say, hey, you at least need to do your due diligence and check out this site in the spring when it could be filled, if it would be filled. And then if it's still not filled with water or there's not a significant number of animals here, then we'll let it go. But if we bring it to someone's attention and say, we think this could be a vernal pool, then it can still have potential to get protected. And so this is what can happen if we do bring it to someone's attention, especially if we already gotten it to the point where we have found enough animals in that temporary wetland. So as of 2006, this is in Maine, which is where I went to undergrad. So that's why I did a lot of research here in these wetlands. If you get it established as significant, then there's a 250-foot critical terrestrial habitat buffer around, starting at where the wetland itself ends and then going out 250 feet. And then you can't touch 75% of that buffer. It has to remain as closed canopy. You can't develop in 75% of it. You have to make sure you maintain forest corridors to the wetland itself. But again, if you're protecting 75% of the forest surrounding that vernal pool, that's going to be pretty possible. They have to agree to minimize forest floor disruption and to even leave native vegetation and downed woody debris, because downed woody debris is oftentimes really important habitat for animals like salamanders that are going to go burrow underneath like log stumps and things like that. And so it needs to be established. So then after it is established, if any kind of development does want to happen within that buffer region, they have to get a permit essentially to do anything like that. And then I didn't include it because it's very similar, but wetlands can also get protected at the federal level if they're brought to the attention of the federals, that there's also a significant number of animals, and then they can have up to a 750-foot buffer saying you can't touch the same 75%. And then they even put a 100-foot envelope around the vernal pool itself saying you can't touch any of that. So the wetland itself and 100 feet out will be protected. So kind of cool. This is just one of the positive notes that I want to provide, that just simply putting the time and effort into studying amphibians and determining that that's a really critical habitat type for that animal, can lead to laws getting put into place that can effectively put protection measures in place for animals like amphibians. So just like something cool to provide students with, it's kind of a positive up note, right? That can result just from learning about animals and their habitat.
Can I just say one thing?
Yep.
Uh, as far as federal wetlands go, they actually, on top of protecting an area, if an area is going to get developed anyways, it actually happens really often around airports for some reason. Um, they don't just have to protect it, but sometimes they can choose to establish new wetland in exchange for taking the old wetland.
Ethan, you're jumping the gun. That's part of my talk.
Oh, my bad.
No, you're good. So I'm going to talk about a specific program that was developed in Maine that is very
Oh,
similar
okay.
to that.
Yeah, my bad then.
No, you're fine. So I'm sure it happens. Mine's actually not at the federal level. Mine's at
Yeah.
the municipal level. So that's really interesting to point out as well that can happen at the federal level, which is exciting. So it's kind of nice to know that it's happening at the federal and just like the city level as well. But yeah, thanks for mentioning that. And so this is what I thought was really interesting. Just recently, I had a friend who happened to send me a picture of amphibians. And I was like, what are you reading about amphibians for? I know you're not doing anything like that. And that's because he came across a significant vernal pool that he found. And so I thought that was just really exciting to know that these establishments are really like they're making an impact still today. In everyday lives. So I just thought I'd mention that. I thought I got really excited um, that these laws are still active and impacting development. So that's really cool. Okay, so before I transition over to climate change and those impacts on amphibians, I wanted to talk about more types of habitat fragmentation or disruption. And so this one's going to focus on barriers a little bit. So this is actually now an animal that we have here at our aquarium, at our facility here in Georgia. So this is the Gulf sturgeon. And what you'll see in here is that's the Gulf sturgeon right there. And then you'll also see swimming up some striped bass. And so both of these animals or these fish are what we call anadromous, which means that they make movements back and forth from freshwater habitat to saltwater habitat in the Gulf of Mexico. And then they'll make migratory movements from the Gulf back upstream and upriver for breeding purposes. So again, they're anadromous, and that means that they make those migration movements from the Gulf all the way upstream as far as 100 miles sometimes for breeding purposes. But with that being said, they are also threatened by something, and that's the putting dams in on waterways. And so if you think about it, if you have this animal that's going to travel up to 100 miles just to get to breeding habitat, and now a dam's in the way, that's going to significantly block or even at times completely create a barrier that doesn't allow them to get to their breeding habitat anymore. So this is a pretty straightforward example of how humans can impact the ecology of some wildlife. And, there needs to be ways to get around that. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But so they're specialized to the point where after hatchlings go out into the Gulf for a couple of years and reach their full sexual maturity, they'll even try to go back to the same point or location where they hatched to do their own breeding. And so think about if a dam goes in between the time when they hatched and when they're going to go back to do their breeding, anything upstream or upriver of that dam is now going to be blocked, and that's no longer going to be accessible to these animals for breeding purposes. And striped bass do the same thing, and they actually are even more specialized in terms of their breeding behaviors, where they have to have a certain amount of water available in a reach for those eggs to even successfully develop, because they can't sink. They have to be flowing for a certain amount of mileage and time under specific temperature conditions for their eggs to be successful. So I'm sure dams are very stressful for those animals as well. And we'll talk about ways that we can overcome that fragmentation, and ways that it has been overcome. So we'll come back to positive notes. Don't worry, everybody. Okay. All right, so let's move on to what a lot of my other research focused on. So what I was working on a lot when I was in my undergrad degree and some research following my undergrad was primarily amphibians in urbanizing landscapes. That was the big topic that we were focusing on there. That's what my lab focused on a lot. It was a very, very interesting lab and a lot of really cool research. And that was all focused on amphibians and urbanizing landscapes and the impacts that urbanization can have on animals. But my master's research focused on another really big anthropogenic impact on wildlife populations, which is climate change. And so just to provide some background information and to put this into context, since around 1950, the Earth's surface has been warming on average by about 0.12 degrees Celsius per decade, and it's projected to warm another 0.3 to 0.7 degrees Celsius at the surface between 2016 and 2035. And then also associated with climate change, there's some predictions for more extreme events in the future, such as increased variability in temperatures, not necessarily just warming, but increased variability in temperatures, difficulty in predicting precipitation patterns. But one thing that I think is possible is more heavy rainfall events. And then I was talking about earlier, potential for increased drought with warming. And that's, at the global level. But then it's also important to think about that there are disproportionate impacts of climate change in some areas relative to others. So some northern locations are warming at 2 to 3 times the rate of the global average. And so that's when Arctic amplification comes into play, which is the rapid surface warming of regions up in northern landscapes. And so surface warming increased by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius between 1963 and 2012 in some northern latitudes. And this is driven primarily by positive feedback loops. So Arctic amplification is driven by what we call positive feedback loops. And that there's a number of them. So I'm just going to provide some real brief information on a couple of these feedback loops because I think they actually are really interesting and it actually is pretty easy to understand. So one of the big ones is we call the albedo effect, which is this idea that if you think about when you're walking in the summer on black surface like asphalt, it's really hot on your feet, right? Like to the point where like it can burn your feet. But if you think about in the subarctic and the Arctic, what's covering the ground most of the time? Snow. If that snow retreats though, because it's warming, what's going to get exposed? Darker surfaces like vegetation, grasses. It's not black asphalt, but it's not really reflective white surfaces like snow and ice. And so when those darker surfaces like vegetation get exposed, they're going to absorb more heat like the pavement will. When they absorb more heat, that's going to warm the environment more. That's going to cause more snow and ice to retreat. Then there's more darker surfaces exposed. That's going to pick up more heat. And you can see how that results in a positive feedback loop, right? So more surfaces get exposed, they're going to pick up more temp, more surfaces, and so on and so forth. And so that's just what this graph is showing. I found this in a publication, and what that graph is showing is between 1960 and around 2005, snow cover extent in blue and sea ice extent in red. And so as you can see, with warming, snow cover and sea ice has declined as a result of warming between the 60s and around 2005. And so sea ice is included in that graph as well, because that's another big contributor of Arctic warming. Is it's the exact same idea. As sea ice retreats, water is a darker surface than the sea ice is. That water is going to hold more water or more temperature, right, the water is going to warm up more than the reflective sea ice would. As the water warms up, more sea ice is going to be lost, so on and so forth. And there's a number of other feedback loops that also are interacting with these two that I just talked about, that are really contributing to this rapid warming. Okay, so what are the impacts of Arctic amplification? Well, we already know it's impacting the habitat of animals found in subarctic and Arctic locations. It can change things like microclimates. We've already seen shifts in vegetation, so that's a big one. We know that tree lines are expanding both in latitude and altitude, so they're moving further upward. And that's a big factor, and I'm going to talk about that as well, especially for amphibians, because they're really sensitive to changes in the environment, and that's kind of why we chose that species, and I'll talk about that. But anyway, this rapid warming, we're already seeing impacts, and one of the noticeable ones is shifts in vegetation. And then when you think about it, if you have a shift in vegetation, that vegetation is going to impact environmental conditions like there's less wind in forests than there are in open landscapes like tundra. There's more shading, so that could cool places more. More snow gets caught and builds up in forest landscapes rather than just a tundra. And so really there's two ways that wildlife can respond to any new limitations that may be posed by these changing conditions. And that's they can either stay put and they can learn to adapt to the new conditions, or they're going to have to start moving as well. And that's something that's also been observed a lot in wildlife populations is animals shifting to remain within suitable conditions.
Yeah, it's like that acronym MAD, move, adapt, or die.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. So it's exactly that. So those are their options essentially. 1 second, please. So what this graph is showing is essentially how polar bears are directly responding. It's just a very straightforward way to show how polar bears are responding to Arctic amplification. So what the blue and green line are showing is when sea ice is going to advance and start forming, and then when polar bears are going to be able to depart, because essentially polar bears are going to go out on that sea ice as soon as they can to get back out into their hunting grounds. And then what red is showing is when sea ice is going to retreat and when it's going to melt, and therefore when polar bears are going to arrive back on land. And so essentially, as you can see on the axis on the bottom, as years have gone by, it's getting earlier. Like bears are arriving on land earlier and they're heading back out later. And so between both those factors, between the 80s and 2014, time spent on land is increasing by 12 days a decade, which is scary. Those are big shifts for polar bears, especially when they really truly rely on time out on the ice for building up those fat reserves and feeding as much as they can. That's where they prefer to be. So I thought that was a really cool graphical representation of a direct impact. And polar bears is a classic example when we're talking about subarctic and Arctic landscapes. And so those are some bears that I saw on land. So it's kind of scary to think about too when you think subarctic. That is the subarctic. It looks really green, right? But it warms up enough to melt away all the snow in the summer, which is why I was able to study frogs there. And so how is this relevant for frogs, what we're talking about, this warming? So we know it can impact big animals in the classics like polar bears, but believe it or not, there's 2 frog species found up in the subarctic where I took that picture of those bears, and that's the wood frog and another frog called the boreal chorus frog. And so they have permeable skin, which, it can allow them to pick up moisture and to breathe through their skin, which is nice. So there's essentially no barrier. They can pick up moisture readily. But the downfall of that is that they can also lose water readily across their skin if they're not found in suitable conditions. So this animal is very dependent on the environment to meet physiological conditions, such as maintaining positive water balance and body temperatures within their threshold, their range of what's they can't go over essentially a critical maxima or below. And then, this can impact multiple stages of their habitat selection throughout their annual life history. So wetlands are going to be important for them in this habitat, and terrestrial habitat. So I studied their terrestrial habitat selection and use. So this is my study site up in the subarctic. I just included this because I want you guys to get an understanding of what the landscape looks like right now, because it's going to be an important part of my talk too. Is that the landscape where I studied up in the subarctic is unique in that about 25% of the landscape, if not more, is covered in wetlands. So it is very wetland heavy, and all of those wetlands are very shallow. They're no more than about a meter deep. And that's because this landscape right now is underlain with permafrost, meaning that essentially those really shallow wetlands are able to persist because there's nowhere for that water to go into the ground because there's a layer of ice underneath them, which is why this landscape is covered in wetlands. But that's also one of the big concerns. So with warming and rapid warming, there's concerns that permafrost is melting. Those wetlands are going to start to drain. Once they drain, the ground is thawed. Vegetation can then start moving into those areas that are now thawed out. And so you can just see how there's lots of changing that can potentially happen between water loss and vegetation movement. And so I'm going to go through it really fast about what we did with my research. So the goal of my research was to understand where these frogs, this is a subarctic frog that I have a picture up top, what they were using for habitat, and if their habitat selection was actually directly related to their physiological conditions. So, is water balance a concern for them up there right now, or body temperature? So we studied both their water balance and their body temperature, and we just wanted to know if that was something they were even taking into consideration currently with their current habitat selection. So, there's potential where you're going to say, no, that didn't matter. Water loss was not a factor in their habitat selection. They were selecting for other things currently. Or, which we did find, is that yes, very much so. Wood frogs right now are taking into account water loss rates. They do use specific micro conditions, environmental conditions such as wind speeds, temperatures, and physical habitat characteristics such as cover from vegetation and standing water to prevent water loss. So they're already taking it into account. And that's a little bit concerning because I just mentioned that a lot of water could start disappearing off that landscape potentially, right? Not necessarily tomorrow or anything like that, but in the future with warming, we could start to see some of those big changes. And so what you're seeing on this screen is plaster models. We can use those plaster models to actually measure water loss rates of frogs. So what you'll also see is those two wind tunnel chambers. We did trials to see if these models actually could even mimic the water loss rates of an actual live frog, and they very much so can. It's kind of cool, actually. So once we validated that these models can represent the water loss rates and body temperature of a live frog, we don't even have to mess with live frogs anymore. We can just deploy these models out in the field and get estimates of water loss rates for animals in the field, which is really nice. Now, we still did mess with frogs because we wanted to actually study their water loss rates where they were found. So what we do is we put little belts on frogs and we follow them around to their specific habitat locations. And then when we find a frog, we deploy these models exactly where they're found and study the exact conditions that they're found under, which is really valuable information to have those known wood frog locations at the microhabitat level up in the subarctic. So really cool system. Sorry, I'm nerding out now, but just to give you an idea of what those models were and what we did. So we measured water loss at every single frog location we found and body temperature. And that's the microhabitat scale. And then we also deployed these models at random locations in 3 different habitat types. So I was kind of talking about how the tree line is shifting in the subarctic right now. We deployed these models at the exact same time in the forest, in the tundra, and then in what we call the ecotone, which is a transition between those 2 distinct habitat types. And we deployed these models with replication in all 3 of those habitat types at the same time to get an understanding of just how the landscape differs in general. is water loss rates very different in the tundra versus the forest, which of course they are, but we wanted to confirm it. Just to kind of say, okay, this is what the tundra looks like now, but it might look like this in the future since we also have information on the forest now as well at the same time. So really cool. And like I said, we found that wood frogs are relying on habitat up there to meet physiological conditions such as maintaining water balance. But what this figure is showing is this was a study that was done, and what it essentially showed is Nunavut, Canada is a little bit more north of my study site. So my study site was in Churchill, Manitoba. This is in Nunavut, which is also in Manitoba, but similar landscape dominated by wetlands. And what you can see is that wetland starting off in 1986. So the wetland area is the black area, the darker shaded region, and then the terrestrial habitat is the gray. And what you see is by 2015, that wetland has shrunk in size significantly. And so that's the trend we're seeing. So I was talking about there's potential for water to be lost. This paper has kind of quantified that and showed that smaller wetlands, wetlands less than a hectare in size, have been decreasing in size further, and even some larger water bodies have been decreasing in size. So that's some research done by Carol and Laboda to kind of put that into context to show that these changes are happening, and there may be reason for concern for amphibians that rely on these wetlands in the subarctic in the future. And so just a couple concerns that can come along with that. I kind of talked about this in the urbanizing landscape, so kind of make a connection between that. This can also lead to isolation of populations. If wetlands are disappearing altogether, especially the small ones that are less than a hectare in size, those are the ones that wood frogs are using for breeding, right? So those are also wetlands that can't support fish, which, believe it or not, it's kind of wild enough to think about that there's frogs up there in this habitat. There's also 2 species of fish up there in that habitat called stickleback, and stickleback will eat your tadpoles just as much as any other fish will. So frogs, even up in the subarctic, are still using smaller wetlands that don't have fish in them. So there's concern that not only are wetlands going to become more isolated if smaller ones are decreasing in size and disappearing, but it may force frogs to start breeding in wetlands where fish are present. So now they're going to have a new predatory impact that they don't have to worry about right now. So lots of concern. And then one thing that we kind of wanted to tackle while we were up there and we didn't get the chance to because it was a weird year and it didn't cool down as early as it had in the past. So kind of, I don't know, not fun to think about, but we weren't able to study the winter conditions because our frogs did not go into hibernation. We had a late rainfall year. And so all of our frogs that we thought were going into hibernation, I guess I should have mentioned that these frogs are really specialized in going into hibernation and freezing solid and then thawing back out, which is why they're able to survive in the subarctic. We found them hunkering down and we thought we were going to figure out where they're hibernating in the subarctic, and then we had a really late rainfall event and they all got flushed out of their what we thought was hibernacula, and then by that time it was too late to keep tracking them. Our transmitters only have so much battery life to them. But what this is showing is that there's potential for frogs to be impacted during the winter as well. So what the black line is showing is temperature in the soil, in the ground, where wood frogs would be hibernating. And as you can see, once that snowpack gets high enough, those temperatures in the ground get really stable. And that's exactly what wood frogs want. That's why they select hibernacula. They want to go into the ground where they can find stable temperature conditions and not have to worry about too many fluctuations. So that once they're in that hibernation mode and they've already produced their cryoprotectants that'll save them, they can have stable conditions. But what's concerning is that with warming, snowpack may now start decreasing as well. And that snowpack is a really important insulating barrier for frogs in habitat. And so even in places like Maine, when I was doing some research on hibernation, we had periods where we lost all of our snowpack and those frogs were exposed. And we saw temperatures warm up, especially and even in the soil. So the soil is no longer going to maintain those stable conditions. So they may thaw out, and then we have to worry about freeze thaw cycles with frogs. That can cause them to burn more energy during the winter. So just wanted to kind of briefly mention that, my research was focused on them during their active time period in the terrestrial habitat, but warming can also impact amphibians during the winter. And this is going to be a concern for more of our southern populations, like in Maine, not necessarily up in the subarctic. The subarctic's still staying pretty cold during the winter. So what can be done? So we just thought that was kind of, I know I went through a long stretch there of the negative impacts of climate change on amphibians, but what can be done? So Ethan kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, how at the federal level, they could kind of force other areas to be protected. So in Maine, they had this special program kind of put in place called the Maine Vernal Pool Special Area Management Plan. And what that says is essentially if any group wants to develop over a vernal pool that is classified as significant, if it's agreed to, they could do that, but then they have to pay a fee to a third party that can put that money towards protecting wetlands in areas that are going to be more suitable anyway. So it's a trade-off, right? It's kind of a win-win for both groups. We'd rather protect wetlands that are clustered together to maintain, those metapopulation vibes and that genetic connectivity. And so we're willing, essentially what it's doing is saying we're willing to give you that wetland that's already in a pretty heavily developed area if we can protect a different one in an area where there's more potential for the frogs and salamanders that are found in that wetland to persist further into the future anyway. Because right, technically they could say no, it's significant, you can't develop over that wetland, but if you're willing to give us money to protect a better one, then we'll let you develop over that one, is essentially what that's saying. And that sounds all simple and fun, but like there's a lot of partners that had to go into this agreement to make such a thing possible. And so that includes things like state and federal regulators, resource agencies, ecologists, economists, real estate developers, and so on and so forth. So you get the picture. Like there's a lot of parties at play that have to make something like that possible and to get that approved. But I think it's really cool that something like that could happen and get agreed upon. And I think that's something that a lot of areas could benefit from, is being able to make progress in a way that's meaningful and kind of accepts the fact that there's going to be development pressures in the future. So if there's going to be those development pressures, let's at least work to protect wildlife while still, not completely making everybody else angry. To me, it's really exciting. It's really cool. I think it's a really cool management plan. And it's a way to show that steps are being taken. It's not all doom and gloom. We don't learn about this habitat that's important to animals and then just focus on, they're getting knocked over. There's cool plans getting put into place to protect them. And I think that's like an important note to focus on moving forward. And hopefully plans like this can inspire other areas. So I know this is done at the municipality level. And once a couple towns did it, some others jumped on. And so that's something else that's kind of a little bit encouraging, is like hopefully we can encourage other areas to take on similar plans or to do things like this. And then I showed you the video of the sturgeon and the bass earlier, and I talked about how there's some fragmentation happening there because dams are put into place and blocking breeding habitat. And so now there are ways to resolve those issues. And so there's a number of different fish passages that can be built now. So that one on the right, what you're seeing is in Maine, and that's just an altogether new created habitat type that was built. So what you can see is the main body of water, that main riverway on the right, kind of over that larger bridge. But what they did is they built a diversion around where a dam would be. And so fish can take that diversion and still be able to make migration movements up and downstream to complete migratory movements. And then what's on the left is a fish ladder. And so that's something else that was man-made, that was built to allow fish to get up and down waterways and around a dam. So really cool. That's some great examples of management that can be done to help benefit animals and overcome some of these challenges, right? So obviously dams are going to get up put places. We need power from them and energy. So So, but this is a nice compromise that also benefits wildlife and kind of helps resolve some of those issues. So another positive note I wanted to throw in there, and I think that's important for students to, provide this information, right? This context of threats that are happening, but then, provide some encouragement and say there are things that can be done if we put the resources forward to make those things happen.
There's also the fish cannons.
Oh God, I haven't heard about the fish cannons.
Yeah. Yeah, they do it. They did it with salmon once or twice in the
No way.
Pacific Northwest.
Do you know if it was successful?
It was, but it was expensive.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So
I didn't provide numbers. I should have provided numbers. If anybody's interested, I can try to find them. They are successful. These methods are successful. So they will put kind of how I put my radio transmitter on my frog and follow them around. Oftentimes, when they implement something new like this, they'll tag a bunch of fish and then they'll kind of put in monitor, or I don't know, reading stations on either side of these new passages that they put in. And then every time a fish goes through, it'll ping, and from those pings they can kind of get an estimate of how successful fish are at moving back and forth, which is really cool too, so that they actually have the numbers to back up and say, okay, these management implications are working. So that's really important to mention as well. And then kind of an example, I know I got to come back to amphibians. So something else that was tested out, one big threat to amphibians in terms of fragmentation, habitat fragmentation. So remember I mentioned habitat loss is one thing if a vernal pool is lost, but fragmentation is another thing, or degradation. A big threat to amphibians and even reptiles like turtles that are crossing the road is getting hit by cars, unfortunately. And so what they were doing here, and what they've tried in a number of locations, is building a culvert underneath the road. So amphibians don't even have to go up and over the road where they can get hit by cars. They can just go underneath. And they'll build big barriers that'll kind of funnel the amphibians into those culverts. And so they're successful. They've gotten some numbers off of these trials as well, and found that amphibians will get funneled into these culverts and successfully travel under the road and get to the habitat they need to. So these movements happen if amphibians are moving from breeding habitat to terrestrial habitat. So once amphibians get done breeding in these temporary wetlands, they'll move elsewhere and use completely different habitat. And so that's oftentimes when amphibians or reptiles can have casualties with cars, as if they're making those migration movements. So kind of interesting to think about. So they've come up with this idea and it works. The amphibians will use it. One potential disadvantage, and I don't know to what extent the benefits are outweighing the disadvantages or the disadvantages are outweighing the benefits, but one potential disadvantage is all animals are getting funneled into one location, and some other animals like predators might learn that all these animals are getting funneled through one location now and may just sit there and pick off these amphibians that are moving through these culverts. But if they're still getting built, they must be outweighing the threat of amphibians having to deal with cars. And so it's still a cool way to resolve fragmentation of roads for amphibians anyway. And then another way is just putting up signage, just even bringing people awareness that animals are moving. We see it all the time for deer, right? Because we don't want to hit deer with our car, and maybe that's a little bit selfish because we're worried about our car, but putting up signage for animals that actually need the protection and not our car is also exciting. And just as simple as putting up a sign can, maybe get people to glance downward a little bit more and avoid hitting any wildlife that are making movements. Because essentially, once they get past that road, then they're off to their habitat and they're good to go from at least that barrier. So another cool, simple way to help out with these threats. And then what else is being done to advance amphibian conservation? So research is a big one, right? We have to learn about what their habitat requirements are before we can even start putting into measure laws or management plans. And so that's where it all has to start. We have to learn about their habitat during all their life stages. So we can't just protect a wetland and then assume they're good. We have to protect their terrestrial habitat that they move into, which is why in Maine, when at the state and federal level, they create those buffers around the wetlands too, is because they want to protect their whole life cycle, not just one component. Because you can protect one component of their life cycle and then them go and try to go to their terrestrial habitat. If that's all knocked down, then nothing was accomplished. So it's important to learn about their whole life cycle. Education and outreach, what's happening right now is, we hope the more we talk about it, more people will become aware of it. Even if it's as simple as saying, keep an eye out for those signs on the roads, and think about watching roads in the spring when it's raining to keep an eye out for amphibians and try to minimize how many amphibians you hit, things like that. So the more education and outreach that can happen, the better. There's things that people can volunteer with. So when I was in Maine, I actually volunteered many nights for what we call the big night, which is these amphibians will move in mass numbers as soon as, remember I was talking about when the ground thaws and the spring rains start to fill those vernal pools. Those same things, those really do cue amphibians in a very strong way, to the point where we try to predict what the big night is. And if you can get a big night, if there's actually a really strong rain event early in the spring, all the amphibians, or most of them, will try to move at the same time. And if you think about it, going out, so I would go out on the big night and we would block off roads, and or not block them off completely, but we would put out big traffic cones and slow people down physically in their cars. And we would take amphibians and we would transfer them across the road to the other side where they were trying to get to, if we knew there was a really dense area of wetlands where there was going to be high migration movements. So it's fun. It gets people out, especially kids, to see these animals, and they love seeing these slimy little guys trying to make their movements. It's cool seeing them in such high numbers. It can get kids excited about amphibians, and it actually just helps them get to their breeding habitat. And then, in Maine, we were talking about establishing significant vernal pools. People can actually get involved with that. People can get trained on how to go out and evaluate and search for vernal pools and create that initial step of trying to count the number of egg masses. And if they find what's deemed a significant number of egg masses, then they can bring that to someone's attention, like an ecologist. But that's a great way that people can go out and volunteer and help actually start protecting some habitat, is trying to find out ways that you can volunteer within your community to benefit amphibians or any wildlife. I'm sure there's programs elsewhere. And maybe that's something I'll look into. And if I find anything, I'll reach back out and provide a link or something like that.
As far as amphibians go, there's a program where you just listen for frog sounds every night and then write it down and then report it.
Yeah, and I think that goes on to a website where you can actually see when the first calls happen each season.
Yeah.
In different locations. So it's kind of like a bird mapper, but for amphibians. Yeah.
Yep.
So
yeah, I've done it in the past. I was looking to start it up here.
Oh, very cool. Yeah. So hopefully we can find a way to post anything we find. But otherwise, just if you're really interested and this sounds like cool stuff to you, like just see if there's anything you're interested that you can volunteer for in your area. It can make a difference for sure. And then what can you do as an individual without this is cool stuff that teachers can recommend to students as well, just to kind of put in their brain a little bit before the end of the talk, right? They don't even necessarily have to go out and do something specific as a program, like volunteer. There's things you can do in your everyday life to make a difference, to reduce emissions. A lot of emissions come from vehicles and transportation, or even, using electricity. So just things like turning off lights and electronics when you're not using them, limiting your air conditioner use. I haven't turned mine on yet this year and I'm melting, but and then, walk and ride bikes when you can. There's things you can do in your everyday lives to help protect the environment, which is always nice to think about.
Yeah.
And then, so why should this matter to people? Why, like looking at big picture, amphibians are fantastic indicator species that help provide insight into environmental health. So if we start to see some really bad trends with amphibians, it could be a pretty good indication that there's something larger going on. And so that's why a lot of my research is focused on amphibians. They're a relatively easy study species to use, and because they're so dependent on the environment, it's sometimes easy to see patterns with them, and we can try to take those patterns that we see with those amphibians and apply it to other wildlife. And then specifically with my research, I was talking about up in the subarctic, I went very broad with it and said we found out that water loss and habitat selection is important for them up there. But in my actual research, we went a step further and we created some statistical models that allowed us to now be able to make predictions of those water loss rates using environmental conditions up in the subarctic. And so now we know that if we put the time into learning how environmental conditions can impact amphibians or other wildlife, why can't we create similar statistical models for other animals and employ that kind of knowledge elsewhere, and start really seeing some patterns? And the nice thing about doing it up in the subarctic is that since it's happening rapidly, that could be a pretty good indication of how things might happen in the future where warming isn't happening as rapidly yet. So that's kind of cool to think about as well. And then to just the everyday person, I mean, we love wildlife, right? Could you imagine like never hearing a bird chirp in the wild anymore or anything like that? Like it'd be sad. Like we care about wildlife, right? Like they have a value just as much as we do, and so this should matter to everybody for those reasons, right? They're part of this environment. I hope that strikes home with everybody a little bit. And with that, so these are just some sources for some of those charts I actually used. So I'll leave that up for a second in case anybody wants to check out those papers. They're cool papers that I provided those figures from. And then I'll end with the wood frog and see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, so I do have a question.
Yes.
So corporations, they account for over 70% of all pollution and habitat fragmentation. And so sometimes it feels very, this is sort of a question and sort of a comment. Sometimes it feels very overwhelming whenever you talk about these issues.
Sure.
So what are some recommendations that you have when discussing these situations that basically feel hopeless with children?
Sure. So I think,
Especially of different age groups.
yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things is that the more people that get inspired and want to go into fields like this, the more corporations might start to feel pressure in the future. And so I think just overall awareness and getting people, I don't know if fired up is the right way to put it, but get fired up and excited about it, and increasing pressure for corporations that, I think eventually like they're gonna start to feel the pressure, and the more people who apply that pressure, the more they're gonna feel it. And I think that's already happening a little bit. So just to like kind of like show kids that there's potential, right? So when I started at the University of Maine in the wildlife field, the class before me had 12 students in it. We had about 30. By the time I was graduating, the freshman class coming in had, I think, like 80 students. So it's getting more, there's more interest for sure. And so I think that's the beauty of environmental education and outreach, even at locations like ours, like the aquarium and the zoo, like kids coming and getting excited. I think that plays a role in them potentially saying like, hey, I want to do that one day.
Yeah.
And the more people we get excited, the more pressure it could apply to corporations.
Sure.
I think that's the best that we can do from like an everyday perspective, especially if we're not in like a higher role. Right.
Yeah, not to sound too anti-corporate here, it just feels like there's no agency, like you can't control what these huge companies are doing. And so sometimes if you talk to kids about it, then they're like, well, what's even the point?
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, strength.
But then you can say, well, there are wetlands that are literally getting protected because at the municipality level, some plans are put into place that is actually in effect. Like they are protecting wetlands that have state laws that say those amphibians in that wetland are protected and you can't touch them. So like you can reiterate that to them and say like that things can happen. Like if we give up, then things like that won't happen, and then they really will be in trouble.
Yeah, that's whenever you read them the Lorax.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it's a good point though. It's a fair point, and it's important, right? Because that's what we want to learn about is how to get students to, not feel hopeless.
Yeah.
Sure.
Cool. That was my biggest question. So
no, that's awesome, and I appreciate it. That's a really good point for sure. Okay, well, awesome. Thanks so much, everybody. I hope this is helpful, and please, feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or want to learn any more about those vernal pool volunteer opportunities or anything like that. And have a good rest of your night, everybody.
Thank you.